I speak to you tonight from a room lit by nothing but a single wavering flame, its glow trembling across stone walls as if unsure it wants to reveal what sits before me. Before we begin, my friend, let me ask you, if these stories resonate with you, if the unease they stir feels familiar, subscribe, leave a comment, share your thoughts, and let this circle of seekers grow. Your voice, your presence here, anchors me more than you know, especially now, when I am no longer certain whether what I hold in my hands is discovery or delusion. I did not intend to read this manuscript. I certainly did not intend to believe it. It came to me wrapped in plain cloth, its pages thin as breath, its ink the color of dying embers, and its author unnamed. Only a single symbol marked the first page, an eye drawn as if half closed in suspicion, or perhaps in sorrow. The man who handed it to me at the forgotten university archive said nothing, only nodded as if passing along a burden rather than a text. I told myself I would examine it the way one examines folklore, calmly, academically, skeptically. That is how these things must begin. A man sits alone, the world held at a safe distance, the flames small, the questions smaller. But as I turned the first fragile sheet, something shifted in the air, a sense of being watched not by a presence, but by a truth, as though the pages themselves waited to see what I would do. The manuscript begins gently enough, with the ramblings of what I assumed was a mystic or poet, someone prone to metaphor and exaggeration. He wrote of a quiet fire beneath the oceans, of serpents of heat moving under continental stone, of changes in the earth that would one day be visible through instruments made of glass and the cold mines of metal. I nearly laughed at that phrasing. Nearly. Because the moment I read those lines, an uncomfortable shadow fell over my memory. I had seen similar descriptions, not in ancient texts, but in recent thermal readings, the kind shared quietly among researchers long before they appear in journals. Patterns no one fully understands, lines of heat that have begun to drift. Coincidence, I told myself. Coincidence is the refuge of the tired mind. But even then, even in that first hour, something in me leaned closer to the flame. The manuscript went on, each sentence written with the calm certainty of someone who knew he would not be believed. He spoke of the sky as a measured pulse, a rhythm that would one day be charted by lenses hurled beyond the breath of air. And again, I wanted to dismiss it. I wanted to stay comfortably anchored in skepticism. But I remembered a recent paper, one I had read in passing, describing anomalous flickers in distant stars, irregularities that no model yet accounts for. Still, I resisted. Doubt is a kind of armor. Belief is exposure. Yet the scribe's words pressed deeper. He mentioned a threshold, a moment in history, when human knowledge would accidentally collide with something older than itself, when prophecy and data would whisper the same sentence. I felt my pulse tighten, a quiet rebellion inside my chest. I do not like when ancient texts pretend to know my century better than I do. I leaned back, letting the flame blur the lines of the page, telling myself I was overreacting, that fatigue had woven patterns where none existed. And yet, another detail caught me. He wrote of a cluster of events arriving in this era, this life I am living, describing them as if he had walked through my headlines, my news feeds, my uneasy dreams. The flame bent sharply, as if exhaling. I looked around the silent room, realizing, with a soft, reluctant dread, that this manuscript was not a riddle. It was a warning. One that had waited for someone, anyone, to sit alone long enough to read it without the noise of the world drowning it out. I closed the pages, breathed deeply, and told myself again that none of this was real. But the doubt had already been planted, and doubt, once planted, grows like a root seeking water beneath stone. Tonight I feel that root moving. And so our journey begins. The deeper I went into the manuscript, the more I felt as if I were not reading it but being read by it. Measured, weighed, examined the way a physician tests a pulse to see whether something invisible is going wrong beneath the skin. I turned to the second bundle of pages with the intention of proving the scribe foolish, derivative, deluded. Instead, I found myself entering a geography of thought so old and so strangely precise that my skepticism felt suddenly childish, like a wooden shield held against a rising tide. The handwriting changed in these pages. The early careful strokes dissolved into something faster, more urgent, as though the unknown scribe wrote with a candle burning low, trying to finish before darkness swallowed the last margin of the night. Yet the content did not ramble. It sharpened. It focused. It spoke of the earth with a confidence I found unnerving, not prophetic in the poetic sense, but prophetic in the scientific sense. The sense of someone who observes with clarity so brutal it becomes a kind of foresight. He wrote of the oceans first, describing them not as bodies of water, but as scrolls in motion, recording heat like ink records words. He wrote that the deep layers, the ones humans cannot reach without instruments, would begin shifting in ways we would first interpret as error, then noise, then anomaly, and only much later as pattern. He described currents bending like threads pulled too tightly, and heat veining its way through cracks in the crust, heating places that had slept cold for centuries. I had seen maps like these, thermal signatures drifting into regions long considered stable. I had dismissed them as something outside my field. Now they stared back at me through the phrases of a man who should not have known such things. The scribe continued, turning to the land above those oceans. He warned that the continents themselves would become restless, not catastrophically at first, but subtly. Tremors in places unaccustomed to trembling, fractures beneath cities built on old stone assumptions. He wrote that the bones of the earth will remember a rhythm out of joint, and that humans would only notice the rhythm after it had already begun. A chill passed through me. Not because his words were dramatic. Many ancient writers invoked earthquakes, but because the scribe listed intervals, described the order of events, the spacing between them, the pattern repeating like a sequence of breaths. I traced one line with my fingertip. The pulse returns once every handful of decades, then again in half that span, then again with no span at all. It echoed something I had heard from a seismologist friend, spoken only half seriously over coffee, about tremors clustering strangely in recent years. Not cyclical, not random, something in between. Still, I resisted. I told myself the manuscript was coincidence layered on coincidence, a tapestry woven by chance. That is what a rational mind does when overwhelmed. It retreats into probability, into the safety of calculated dismissal. But the next section stripped that comfort from me. The scribe wrote of the sky, not metaphorically, not symbolically. Scientifically, or something close to it, using language that felt impossibly modern despite its age. He described the sky as a rhythm that will be divided into measures by human lenses hurled beyond the reach of breath. He spoke of irregular flickers in the distant fires, and how those flickers would line up with changes in the Earth's temperature, magnetic fields, even the moods of entire populations. I paused there, my pulse heavy, because I had recently seen a fragment of a paper, a preliminary draft circulated among researchers, suggesting that certain stellar irregularities might influence cosmic ray patterns that subtly affect the atmosphere. It was an idea too speculative to publish, too risky to take seriously. Yet the scribe had written it as fact, as if he had watched it happen. I leaned back from the manuscript, the flame wavering in the draft from the window. My breath had grown shallow without my noticing. I told myself again that this was madness, that I was drawing connections where none existed. Humans are wired to find patterns, even false ones. That is our weakness, our evolutionary inheritance. But then I saw the next set of notes. In the margins, Written in a different hand, perhaps centuries later, someone had added dates, modern dates. Whoever handled this manuscript before me had already begun aligning the scribe's intervals with actual measurements. The ink of those notes was not ancient. It was recent, perhaps only decades old. I felt as though I had intruded into a conversation between two people who had lived generations apart. I tried to steady myself by looking at the manuscript from a historian's perspective. Perhaps the scribe was guessing. Perhaps his words were the lucky poetry of someone attuned to natural cycles. But the next portion of the manuscript robbed that explanation of its comfort. The unknown scribe shifted suddenly to human behavior, not in vague terms, not in moralistic admonitions. He described psychological patterns as if he were charting nerve impulses. He wrote of fear traveling like a shadow carried by wind, the way societies grow anxious before they understand why. The way unrest spreads not because of information, but because of something he called the trembling of the collective mind. He named intervals, short ones, long ones, growing closer each generation. He wrote that when these intervals finally overlap, humanity would feel as though the world itself has begun breathing faster. And recently, I had felt it too, not in a mystical sense, in the everyday sense. Conversations with colleagues carried a tension none of us could articulate. News cycles shifted faster than attention could follow. People spoke of exhaustion the way one speaks of rain, a thing that simply is now. A baseline. I wanted desperately to shut the manuscript, to smother the flame, to put distance between myself and the pages. But curiosity is a predator. Once it sinks its teeth in, it does not let go. I read on. The scribe described a pattern of knowledge, a dangerous convergence where disciplines kept separate by human pride would begin whispering the same warning. He predicted that researchers in unrelated fields would sense an alignment they could not justify, that their data, chemical, astronomical, biological, economic, would begin converging toward a single, terrible conclusion. He wrote, "When the people of glass and metal find themselves speaking the words of the prophets, the era of ignorance will end." I whispered the line aloud, and the sound of it frightened me, because I had heard something similar only weeks before. A climatologist joking that her data sounds like prophecy, an astrophysicist admitting he felt as if something is coordinating the chaos, a linguist saying that ancient texts seem more diagnostic than symbolic. Different fields, different languages, same unease. The manuscript continued, describing something the scribe called the threshold, a moment not defined by catastrophe but by realization, a tipping point of understanding when humans would recognize that the world was not unraveling randomly but according to a pattern that had been expected, measured, described before they were born. And then came the most unsettling part. The scribe claimed that when this threshold neared, individuals, not institutions, would begin to feel it first, not through visions or dreams, through patterns they could not stop noticing, through coincidences that felt orchestrated, through an inexplicable sense of being watched, not by a presence, by a truth. I closed my eyes then, my fingers resting lightly on the parchment. A tremor passed through me, as though the room had inhaled. I told myself it was only fatigue, only imagination, only the tricks of a mind deprived of sleep. But doubt is no longer a flicker. It has become a slow-burning ember, and I fear that in reading this manuscript, I have already stepped onto the threshold the scribe warned about, the place where belief becomes less frightening than the consequences of ignoring what stands before me. I am not ready to accept his prophecy, but I am no longer able to dismiss it, not after what comes next. I approached the third cluster of pages, telling myself that what I was about to read could only weaken the spell the manuscript had begun to cast. Critical thinking is, after all, a discipline of resistance, the mind's immune system. And yet, even before my fingers touched the parchment, I sensed that the scribe's voice had grown closer, as if he had pulled a chair up to my table and now sat across from me, waiting to see whether I would continue. The ink of these pages was darker, almost oily, as though written during a night heavy with storm or smoke. There were scorch marks along the edges, small but unmistakable, suggesting that these sheets once survived a fire. I traced one of the burned corners with my thumb, imagining the unknown scribe shielding these pages with his own hands before they could turn to ash. I wondered what kind of man protects warnings instead of himself. The first sentence of Part 3 struck me like a whisper spoken too close to the ear. The stars are not distant, they are clocks. I felt the flame beside me tremble. The scribe went on to describe the heavens not through mythic imagery, but through a structure uncannily similar to the language of modern astrophysics. He argued that the stars flicker with intention, that their brightening and dimming, the irregularities we catalog in data tables, are not random, not strictly physical, but signals, timings, pulses. I paused, recalling something a colleague in stellar observation once confessed privately, that a handful of stars in distant sectors seemed to display flicker cycles that did not match any known variable star pattern. He dismissed it as instrumentation error. They always dismiss it that way at first. The scribe described these stellar pulses as the first alphabet of creation, a language predating scripture, predating humanity, predating even the dream of religion. He wrote that the early priests once sensed this alphabet intuitively, translating cosmic rhythms into rituals, calendars, stories, imperfect interpretations of a perfect pulse. But humanity, he said, forgot the intention behind the flicker. He warned that in the era when the lenses of cold metal are cast above the wind, humans will rediscover the pattern, but only by accident, not through mysticism, but through measurement. I leaned back, rubbing my temples, reminding myself that ancient writers frequently poeticized the sky. That does not make them prophets. But the next lines undermined my comfort again. The scribe referenced specific intervals, long cycles that modern astronomers call secular variations, and shorter ones we classify as quasi-periodic oscillations. He described how these cycles would one day align, creating a rare synchronization, like the chiming of bells across unseen cathedrals. The alignment, he claimed, would influence not fate, not magic, but physical forces. The magnetic breath of planets, the circulation of their oceans, the energetic patterns in their ionosphere. This was not mystical rambling. This was physics written in metaphor. I remembered reading a research proposal, unofficial, unpublished, by a group of scientists investigating whether stellar oscillations could subtly influence space weather patterns on nearby planetary systems. They were cautious, careful, skeptical, but curious, always curious. Now I saw their questions reflected in a manuscript centuries old. The scribe shifted then, leaving the heavens to speak of what lies beneath the surface of the earth. He described thermal anomalies rising, not sporadically, but in pulses, cycles of heat that mirror celestial rhythms. He wrote of magma plumes moving with the breath of the stars, predicting that modern instruments would detect unexpected heating in regions once considered geologically dormant. Again, I resisted belief. Again, the scribe offered no mercy. I remembered the sealed report I had stumbled across months earlier, a draft analysis of inexplicable geothermal activity recorded across multiple oceanic crusts. The report dismissed its own findings. The anomalies were outside predicted behavior, therefore they were assumed to be measurement error. Yet the manuscript wrote of them as inevitabilities. I steadied myself with logic. Pattern recognition is seductive, too seductive. It makes conspirators out of coincidences. And yet, the scribe's precision gnawed at the walls of my certainty. The next section turned abruptly inward, toward the human mind, the human body, the human experience. The scribe wrote of the mark in the blood, a phrase that at first sounded like theological symbolism. But his description was specific. He spoke of genetic fragments dispersed irregularly across nations, fragments that, when mapped globally, would form a pattern resembling a constellation. I felt my skin tighten. Weeks earlier, a geneticist friend had mentioned, almost jokingly, an odd distribution of a rare genetic motif across unrelated populations. She had said it looked like a map of something, but she couldn't articulate what. She brushed it aside as randomness. The scribe had drawn the same shape, centuries earlier. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing slowly, feeling the edges of a realization I did not want to accept. The manuscript was not revealing new information. It was reordering information I already had, aligning fragments across disciplines that rarely speak to each other. The scribe continued with unnerving clarity. He described the rise of a phenomenon he called the trembling of societies, a psychological quickening that spreads globally, independent of culture, language, economics. He wrote that entire populations would begin to feel a subtle dread, not in response to news or disaster, but before it. Anticipatory fear. A shadow arriving before the object that casts it. And, recently, I had sensed it too. In colleagues, in friends, in strangers on the street whose eyes flickered with an unspoken pressure they could not articulate. The scribe wrote that this trembling was not mystical at all. It was the resonance of living matter with the pulse of the heavens, a biological response to a cosmic alignment. I pushed the manuscript away then, staring at the wall, forcing myself to detach, to analyze, to rationalize. But the flame beside me had grown steadier, as if the room itself was settling into the rhythm the scribe described. I returned to the text reluctantly. The scribe's final paragraph in this section chilled me in a way the earlier pages had not. He wrote, "There will come a generation that believes itself alone, rational, sovereign over nature. When that generation finds its instrument speaking the words of its prophets, understanding will dawn like a storm. Some will see it as awakening. Others will see it as the end." My throat tightened. The manuscript lay open before me, the pages trembling slightly in the shifting air. I felt watched again, not by a presence, but by the convergence of patterns, by the realization that disbelief was no longer protecting me. It was isolating me. For the first time since I began this journey, I understood that my resistance was not strengthening me, it was eroding me. The manuscript was not forcing belief upon me. It was forcing me to choose between confronting the patterns or pretending they do not exist. And I feared that the next pages, the ones I had yet to turn, would make that choice impossible to avoid. By the time I reached the fourth cluster of pages, the flame beside me had grown steady, almost unnervingly so, as though it had resigned itself to illuminating what I could no longer pretend not to see. I hesitated before touching the parchment again. A part of me feared that continuing would be an act of surrender, not to mysticism, not to superstition, but to a kind of pattern recognition that once accepted cannot be undone. The unknown scribe was no longer a distant voice. He had begun to feel like a presence in the room, watching whether I chose ignorance or understanding. These pages were shaken by age, the ink lighter, the script trembling. If the earlier writings carried urgency, these carried exhaustion, not a loss of clarity, but the weight of a man who had spent his life wrestling with something immense and unyielding. The first line of this section felt like a confession whispered between two breaths. When the ground begins to echo the sky, the patient will not survive the diagnosis. The scribe wrote of the earth's crust as though it were a great, aching body. A patient whose symptoms modern science would eventually measure but fail to interpret. He described deep fractures under ancient cities, fractures that would grow not from local strain, but from long unseen forces, rising through the bones of the world, the way fever rises through the bones of a child. He claimed these fractures would correlate with celestial rhythms, forming a pattern that geologists would first dismiss and later fear. I felt a cold recognition stir inside me. Months earlier, I had seen a preliminary map showing unexpected microfractures emerging beneath regions considered tectonically stable. The researchers blamed industrial activity, groundwater shifts, anything but geophysical synchrony. The idea that the Earth could respond to cosmic cycles was simply too large, too unscientific to consider. Yet the scribe had written those same intervals, those same regions, centuries before the first seismograph was ever imagined. I turned the page with a sense of dread. The manuscript shifted abruptly to cycles of human history, not dates, patterns. The scribe outlined intervals of social unrest, not tied to leaders or wars, but to something deeper. He wrote that humanity moves through periods of trembling the way a heart moves through arrhythmias, irregular, often undetected, but increasingly dangerous when they cluster. He described cycles of upheaval, short bursts of tension followed by long periods of quiet, then tighter clusters, then outbreaks on multiple continents as if choreographed by an unseen conductor. He called these cycles the shiver of consciousness, claiming they were not caused by political events, that political events were symptoms, not causes. According to him, these waves of unrest corresponded to fluctuations in background magnetic fields. He described a force he called the silent wind, a term that now eerily resembles what modern researchers call geomagnetic variation. I thought back to conversations I had overheard between colleagues working in environmental psychology, who had been examining strange correlations between global anxiety levels and periods of heightened geomagnetic activity. They had dismissed it as coincidence, an artifact of data noise. The scribe dismissed nothing. He wrote with certainty. I pressed my fingers to my temples, trying to resist the tightening sensation inside my chest. This was not prophecy. This was pattern. And patterns, once seen, cannot be unseen. The next section of the manuscript was marked by smudged ink and uneven lines, as if the scribe had been writing while traveling. He described droughts, not as meteorological events, but as memory loss in the lungs of the earth. He outlined how weather patterns would grow erratic, not due to human error alone, though he acknowledged human influence, but due to a larger oscillation, a cosmic barometer shifting pressure across the planet. He predicted chaotic seasons, heat appearing during cold months, storms forming where calm had ruled for centuries, rainfall rearranging itself like an indecipherable script. He wrote of atmospheric forgetfulness, a phrase that chilled me with its strange accuracy. Meteorologists increasingly speak of disrupted jet streams, wandering polar vortices, circulations failing to behave according to historical models. The scribe knew this long before there were models. I gripped the edge of the table, steadying myself. I told myself again, that ancient writers often dramatized nature. But dramatization does not usually come with intervals, correlations, and references to patterns no one of his era should have observed. And then the section took an even more unsettling turn. The scribe described a window of convergence, a narrow span of years when celestial oscillations, terrestrial shifts, atmospheric anomalies, and human unrest would begin to overlap so tightly that the world would feel as though it were accelerating. He wrote, "When the pulse of heaven, the breath of earth, the silence of the waters, and the trembling of nations fall upon a single span, the threshold will open. It will not slam like a door. It will exhale like a dying flame." I read the lines again and again, my breath shallow. This was no longer prediction. It was diagnosis. And the time period he described, though he never used our system of dates, mapped disturbingly well onto the current decade. I wanted to stop. I should have stopped. But curiosity is a kind of moral gravity. Once you lean over the edge, the fall becomes inevitable. The next portion was perhaps the most disturbing so far. The scribe spoke of human perception, how individuals sensitive to pattern would begin noticing coincidences forming chains. He described people reporting strange synchronicities, unease without reason, dreams repeating symbols they had never studied. He claimed this was not mysticism, but neurological resonance, a biological echo of cosmic alignment. In the margin of this page, written in a shaky but modern hand, someone had scrawled, "Confirmed in contemporary psychology. See unpublished study, 19. The final digits were smudged beyond recognition. I closed my eyes, inhaled slowly, and realized something fundamental. The scribe was not merely describing physical shifts. He was describing the mental and emotional climate of entire populations. The rising dread, the inexplicable sense of acceleration, the feeling that something unnamed is gathering on the horizon. I felt that dread. I had felt it long before reading this manuscript. And here it was, written by a man who lived centuries ago, using metaphors and structures that mirror our modern data more precisely than chance should allow. I read the final lines of the section in silence. Truth arrives not as revelation, but as accumulation. A moment will come when the world raises its head, and for the first time sees the shape of the shadow it has been walking in. On that day, denial will become a luxury no mind can afford. I set the manuscript down. My hands were trembling. The room was silent, except for the flame. And I understood, with a clarity that frightened me, that I was no longer trying to prove the scribe wrong. I was trying to prepare myself for what he would say next. I approached the fifth portion of the manuscript with a heaviness I had not felt before. Not dread, exactly, but the weight that comes when a pattern is no longer hypothetical, no longer a curiosity, but something alive in the mind. The flame beside me flickered with a strange steadiness, as if it too had entered into a pact with the pages. My skepticism, once a shield, now felt like a thin cloth held against a rising storm. These pages were different. The parchment was thicker, as if the scribe had chosen a sturdier material for what he was about to reveal. The ink was darker, more deliberate, the strokes precise as though written in a moment of clarity so intense it bordered on agony. I sensed that this was where the manuscript stopped observing the world and began dissecting it. The first lines were clinical in their coldness. The body remembers truths the mind refuses to learn. I felt a shiver travel through me. The scribe was no longer speaking of stars or oceans. He was descending into the intimate landscape of the human body, into the coded memory written into flesh. He described something he called the fragment in the blood. Not a mutation, not a disease, but a rare genetic segment dispersed like scattered constellations across distant populations. He claimed it was ancient, predating known migrations, predating even the earliest civilizations. The fragment, he wrote, acts like a marker for sensitivity. Individuals who possess it are more prone to noticing patterns, to sensing shifts before instruments detect them. I read the paragraph twice, my breath slowing. Weeks earlier, a geneticist I knew had shared a bizarre observation, a single rare nucleotide sequence appearing sporadically across unrelated lineages, forming a shape on population maps that made her uneasy. She joked that it looked like a constellation, a remark I had found poetic at the time. The scribe had drawn the same shape centuries ago. He went on to describe how this genetic fragment would become increasingly activated, not by mystical forces, but by environmental stressors, shifts in magnetism, fluctuations in atmospheric ionization, irregularities in solar radiation. He claimed this would cause a subtle increase in global sensitivity, heightened anxiety, vivid dreams, unexplained intuition, a collective nervous system stirred awake. I thought of the people around me, colleagues speaking of restless nights, friends describing a pressure in the chest they could not name, strangers online confessing that the world feels off in ways they cannot explain. The scribe's words felt like a diagnosis of the present, but he did not stop there. He described the spread of something he called cognitive trembling, small tremors of thought that ripple through societies before any physical event occurs. He wrote that humans would begin sensing shifts in the world the way animals sense earthquakes, a rising tension, a subtle panic, a confusion that grows not from information but from instinct. As I read, a knot tightened in my stomach. In recent months, I had heard variations of this from too many people to ignore. I feel anxious for no reason. It's like the air is heavier. It feels like something's coming. The scribe had known this, not as metaphor, as fact. Then, unexpectedly, the manuscript shifted into the language of anatomy. The scribe wrote of the brain as if he had seen one dissected, describing structures that, in his era, should have been unknown. He spoke of the limbic system as the fire chamber, the hippocampus as the gate of memory, the prefrontal cortex as the judge that trembles before truth. He claimed that during certain cosmic alignments, the brain becomes more receptive, not to visions, but to pattern detection, to the truth hiding in repetition. He wrote, "In the era of convergence, the minds of men will overheat with recognition. They will sense alignment even before they understand it." This line struck me with a force I could not contain. Recognition is precisely what I feared in myself. I was not convinced by the manuscript because it was persuasive. I was convinced because it was familiar. The scribe was describing not prophecy, but cognition. I forced myself to slow down, to breathe, to regain detachment. But the manuscript dragged me deeper. He wrote of dreams next, dreams carrying symbols that repeat across cultures during periods of global stress. He described images of collapsing structures, rising water, falling stars, unending corridors, clocks without hands. I had seen studies about shared symbolic dreams, dismissed by mainstream science as psychological coincidence. But the scribe claimed these dreams were neurological attempts to translate cosmic shifts into imagery the mind could understand. And then he wrote something that chilled me more than any cosmic theory. There will come a generation that believes dreams irrelevant, yet they will all dream the same shadow. I paused, my throat tight. Over the past year, how many people had mentioned dreams of falling skies, of tides rising in impossible silence, of running without reaching safety? Too many. I turned the page. Here the manuscript became darker, more somber. The scribe described individuals like himself, and, I feared, like me, who begin noticing patterns across disciplines. He wrote that such people would feel isolated, doubting their own sanity, because seeing what others refuse to see is indistinguishable from delusion. He warned, "The first symptom of awakening is loneliness." I closed my eyes. The room felt colder. The flame swayed slightly, as if a silent breath had swept through the space. The scribe continued, "The one who sees the pattern will try to remain neutral, but the pattern will not remain neutral with him." This line struck something deep in me. I had felt this, the sense that the manuscript was not merely information, but momentum. Once noticed, the pattern exerts gravity. It pulls. And then came the most dangerous claim of this section, the one I feared reading but could not ignore. The scribe described what happens when scientific fields begin mirroring ancient warnings. He wrote, "When the studies of the age begin to speak the language of the prophets, the era of denial will collapse. What was myth will become mechanism. What was symbol will become signal." I felt a tremor pass through my hands. In recent months I had seen papers, speculative, cautious, but undeniable, whose conclusions resembled old texts more than modern predictions. It no longer felt like coincidence. It felt like convergence. The final paragraph of this section was written with an uneven, almost trembling hand. There will be a moment when you cannot tell whether the manuscript describes the world or the world describes the manuscript. When that moment arrives, understand that the threshold is no longer approaching. You are standing in it. I set the pages down, my breath unsteady. For the first time since beginning this journey, I felt a sharp, undeniable fear, not of prophecy, not of disaster, but of recognition. because the scribe's words were no longer predictions. They were descriptions of a reality I already inhabit. And I knew, with sinking certainty, that the next section would not offer comfort. It would offer confirmation. I approached the sixth portion of the manuscript with a kind of reluctant reverence, as though I were about to unseal a room in a forgotten temple, one whose darkness remembered every intruder who had ever dared to enter. The air around me felt different now, heavier, almost saturated with expectation. I realized, with a quiet dread, that I was no longer reading the manuscript to understand it. I was reading it to understand myself inside it. These pages had been written with a sharper hand, the ink more controlled, the lines straighter, as if the scribe had reached a moment of terrifying clarity. There was no panic in the writing now, only inevitability. The first sentence was a blow. What you call knowledge is only the most recent layer of a long, buried memory. I had to sit still for a moment, the words striking deeper than they should have. It was as if the scribe were speaking through time directly to me, bypassing the centuries, bypassing language, speaking into the center of the doubt that had been tightening around my ribs since the first page. The scribe continued with a calmness that unnerved me. I write this not to warn the wise, for they need no warning, but to guide the reluctant, those who will recognize the truth only when it stands beside them, breathing. The room felt smaller. The flame seemed to lean toward the pages. Here the manuscript shifted into a realm I had not expected, the realm of interdisciplinary convergence. The scribe described how knowledge isolated for thousands of years would begin to merge, not through collaboration but through necessity. He wrote that fields once considered incompatible would begin producing results that echoed one another. Geology imitating cosmology, climatology imitating prophecy, neuroscience imitating theology. He called this phenomenon the marriage of languages, and he claimed it would happen only once in human history, during the era he called the witness generation, the first and last to see all patterns at once. I felt something tighten in my throat. I had seen hints of this. Scientists from entirely different disciplines quietly confessing that their findings felt connected to something larger, though none dared define it. The scribe defined it. He wrote, "When the earth trembles in the same rhythm as the stars, when the nations tremble in the same rhythm as the earth, the minds of men will tremble in the same rhythm as each other. This is resonance. This is the threshold." The idea was terrifying because it did not require belief. It required only observation. I forced myself to continue. The scribe turned then to the idea of hidden manuscripts, not mystical texts, but lost observations, early records, fragmented studies sealed in monasteries and burned in libraries. He claimed that the people of his era had noticed these patterns before, but lacked the tools to measure them. They wrote them down anyway, hoping someone in a future age would have instruments sharp enough to see what they had only felt. I sat frozen as the scribe described a forgotten archive, beneath a monastery whose location he encoded in symbols, a monastery whose ruins I had read about in an archaeological journal years earlier, a monastery destroyed by fire centuries ago, where burnt fragments of unknown texts were discovered but never translated. I remembered a note from that article. Ashes contained traces of multiple scripts, likely ritual in nature. The scribe had known this archive. He had written these words as if he expected us to find it. My pulse quickened, but the manuscript grew darker still. The scribe described what happens when humans approach what he called the unavoidable conclusion, that the universe is not a series of disconnected forces, but a single system breathing in cycles. He wrote that once this realization dawns collectively, people will divide sharply into two groups, those who feel liberated and those who feel hunted by understanding. He warned, knowledge does not comfort the unprepared, it exposes them. I felt exposed, not intellectually, emotionally. The manuscript then described the role of individuals like me, the reluctant interpreters, he called them. People who do not seek patterns, but cannot help seeing them. People who do not want to believe, but cannot return to ignorance once the pieces align. He wrote, "You will deny it first. You will defend your denial. And then you will stand in the silence of your accumulated evidence and feel the ground shift beneath you." I inhaled sharply. It was not a warning. It was a description of my exact state. I had denied, I had defended. And now I felt the shift. The scribe went on to describe how these reluctant interpreters would eventually become bridges between disciplines, between eras, between the language of science and the language of ancient testimony. He claimed their role would be to articulate what institutions could not, the unbearable truth that all data pointed toward the same conclusion. He wrote, "Science will speak the words of Scripture. Scripture will speak the words of science. And the world will finally understand both." A chill swept over me, because that convergence had already begun. Climate patterns resembling ancient flood descriptions, astronomical irregularities echoing ancient star portents, psychological distress mirroring apocalyptic metaphors, genetic anomalies resembling marks written in ancient lore. None of it supernatural, all of it natural, all of it observable, all of it converging. The next paragraph shook me more than anything I had read before. "There will come a moment when the one who reads these pages will recognize himself inside them. When you reach that moment, understand, you were not chosen. You were positioned." The room felt unbearably still. Am I positioned? Why me? Why now? The scribe seemed to anticipate these questions. "It is not your belief that matters, it is your vantage point. What you call coincidence is only the alignment of vision with necessity." I closed the manuscript then, pressing my palms against the table, feeling the wood tremble beneath my touch. For the first time, I was truly frightened. Not by the scribe, not by prophecy, but by how precisely his words mirrored my own internal collapse of certainty. The final lines of Part 6 were nearly illegible, as though written in shaking hands. I had to hold the parchment close to the flame to read them. When knowledge begins to haunt you, you are no longer collecting facts. You are being collected by them. Prepare yourself. The next pages contain what science will confirm, and what humanity will fear. I lowered the page, my breath shallow. The manuscript lay open like a wound, and I understood with a cold, quiet dread that the descent had only begun. By the time I reached the 7th cluster of pages, the room no longer felt like a room. It felt like an antechamber, a place one stands only briefly, only once, before moving into something vast and irreversible. The flame beside me had thinned into a long, trembling spear of light, as if stretching upward to witness what the scribe was about to reveal. I drew the pages closer, telling myself I was still in control, still anchored in reason. But the truth was simpler. I could no longer stop. The parchment here was brittle, water-stained, warped by age, and, I sensed, by fear. The scribe's handwriting trembled in places, growing smaller, as though he had been writing in secrecy, glancing over his shoulder, pressing his thoughts into the page before someone, or something, could intervene. The first line struck like a blade plunged quietly into the mind. "The greatest danger is not what approaches, but that men will see it and pretend blindness." I felt the weight of those words settle into me like sediment. The scribe was no longer discussing ancient rhythms or cosmic patterns. He was speaking now of humanity's final defense mechanism, denial so absolute it becomes self-inflicted amnesia. He continued, "When the threshold nears, truth will become unbearable, not because of its terror, but because of its clarity." The scribe shifted abruptly into descriptions not of nature, but of institutions, of how governments, academies, religions, and global organizations would react when evidence began aligning too perfectly with predictions once dismissed as myth. He wrote, "Those who built their power upon certainty will fear the collapse of certainty more than the collapse of the world." I read the line twice, feeling its resonance in headlines, in cautious interviews, in the tight smiles of scientists who suspect more than they dare say. The scribe continued, outlining how scientific bodies would respond when their findings started matching ancient warnings. First denial, then reframing, then silence, then the quiet, desperate search for confirmation. I froze, because I had seen those exact stages unfold in real time. In research groups studying climate anomalies, in astrophysicists discussing unexplained stellar flickers, in psychologists charting rising global anxiety. They joked, dismissed, joked again, then fell silent. The same silence the scribe described centuries ago. The manuscript grew more pointed. The scribe wrote that a small number of individuals, those positioned at intersections between fields, would begin to experience a kind of mental exhaustion, a collapse of skepticism, not from belief, but from accumulation. He wrote, "Truth is a weight. The first to notice it are those standing in its shadow." The room felt suddenly colder. The flame dimmed, then steadied. I realized I was no longer reading academically. I was reading autobiographically. The next section of the manuscript described something I had never expected an ancient writer to articulate: the modern scientific method, or rather, its blind spots. The scribe wrote, "You think knowledge is built by evidence. It is built by permission." I felt breath catch in my throat. He continued, "When the evidence exceeds what is permitted to be believed, the mind fractures. Half becomes believer. Half becomes protector of denial." I felt this fracture inside myself, a splitting between the part that clung to rationality and the part that could no longer deny the coherence of the manuscript. Then came the most unsettling portion yet. The scribe claimed that during the era of convergence, humans would begin encountering contradictory confirmations, pieces of evidence that first appear unrelated, then impossible, then unavoidable. He listed domains: seismic irregularities, atmospheric inversions, magnetic anomalies, astronomical flicker cycles, behavioral contagion, genetic clustering, dream convergence, economic tremors, unexplained global unrest. He wrote, "These will not be separate crises. They will be one pattern wearing many masks." I read those lines with a sinking realization. I had seen each of these individually. I had just never dared put them together. The scribe must have anticipated this. He wrote, "The mind trained in fragments will fail to see the whole. That is the danger of your age. Expertise without comprehension." A chill moved through me, slow and deliberate. Then the scribe turned personal. He wrote of the individual who finds this manuscript, the reader chosen not by destiny, but by proximity to truth. "You will feel watched, not by eyes, by evidence." My breath faltered, because that was exactly how it felt. The scribe continued, describing how the reader, me, would try to dismiss each connection until the mind could no longer deny the geometric precision of the pattern. He wrote, "There will come a point when you stop asking whether the prophecy is real and begin asking why you were allowed to see it." I read that line again and again, feeling its weight press against my spine. Allowed, not destined, not chosen, allowed. A quiet, terrible implication. The scribe then described a phenomenon he called the encroaching confirmation, the moment when evidence begins matching prophecy too precisely to ignore. He warned that the reader would feel torn between speaking and remaining silent. He wrote, "To speak is to risk disbelief. To remain silent is to betray truth." Both paths wound the soul. I exhaled shakily. He anticipated even the emotional state I was in. Then came the most dangerous statement yet. "When you feel the manuscript whisper in your own thoughts, understand, this is not possession, but recognition, truth merging with awareness." A sense of vertigo washed through me. Had the manuscript begun whispering? Had the patterns begun speaking through memory, through intuition, through doubt? I pressed my palm against the table to steady myself. The scribe's final lines in this section twisted something deep inside me. Do not fear what you are learning. Fear what humanity will do when it learns too late. The room was silent. The flame bent toward the pages, as if reading with me, and I understood, with a clarity I wished I could unfeel. That was not just the turning point of the manuscript. It was the turning point of my mind. I approached the 8th section of the manuscript with a steadiness I did not fully trust. The flame had thinned into a pale ribbon, and for a moment I wondered whether the air itself had grown colder or whether I had simply become too attuned to the silence pressing in around me. I no longer felt the shock I once did when the scribe's words aligned with my own experience. Shock implies surprise. What I felt now was recognition, familiarity, a quiet acceptance that the trajectory of this revelation had already been set long before I began reading. The pages of this section were stained in patterns that resembled branching nerves, as though time itself had etched veins across the parchment. The ink was uneven, blotched in places, yet the scribe's hand remained steady, as if he wrote these lines during a period of rare clarity. The first sentence met me with a weight that settled into my bones. The intellect resists truth until truth acquires evidence, and then the intellect resists the evidence. I felt a slow, internal yielding, the acknowledgement that my own resistance had followed that path exactly. I had dismissed, questioned, doubted, redoubted, and then, gradually, folded under the cumulative pressure of patterns too coherent to ignore. The scribe continued. When the convergence enters its final approach, knowledge will no longer appear in isolated domains, but in harmony, not by intention, but by inevitability. Here he shifted into a kind of inventory, listing the areas where harmonies would emerge. Climatological anomalies mirroring ancient seasonal warnings, volcanic stirrings aligning with celestial oscillations, deviations in atmospheric chemistry echoing forgotten texts, tremors in economic systems reflecting old prophetic cycles, social unrest mirroring previous epochs of magnetic disturbance, psychological fragility increasing with geomagnetic instability. I read each line slowly, breathing through the sensation that this was less a prediction and more a commentary on the world outside my window. The scribe wrote with the calm certainty of someone who had already watched these cycles unfold once before, perhaps more than once. He wrote, "The greatest illusion of your age is the belief that complexity equals chaos, but complexity is often the signature of an underlying order." I pressed my fingers lightly against the page. I had heard a mathematician say something nearly identical only weeks before, in a moment of candid fatigue, as if he couldn't quite believe what his models were suggesting. The scribe turned next to astronomy, not mythology. Astronomy. He described how the outer layers of certain stars would begin fluctuating in rhythm with subtle variations in the Earth's magnetic field. He wrote that researchers would initially dismiss the correlation as statistical noise, because they would test only for coincidence, not for causation. He claimed that only after multiple disciplines independently confirmed the same convergence would the scientific community begin to whisper the possibility of a shared mechanism. I remembered a colleague's offhand remark about timing irregularities in a star system we monitor, something she chalked up to equipment calibration issues. Yet her tone carried unease. The manuscript continued with quiet inevitability. The sky does not command the earth. It reflects it. The earth does not obey the sky. It resonates with it. I felt that sentence settle into me like a key turning in a long-locked door. Then the scribe turned downward, into the deep earth. He described magma rising in pulses, synchronized with external cycles. He described cracks forming beneath coastal regions once considered geologically stable, their timing aligned with solar minima and maxima. He described tremors surfacing not randomly, but in a kind of sequence, the world's crust exhaling its tension through invisible channels. I had seen similar discussions buried in research forums, whispered in private conversations between geophysicists who feared their models were revealing something they did not have language for yet. The scribe had language. He lacked only an audience capable of hearing it. Here the manuscript darkened. The scribe wrote of human institutions. They will see the signals. They will measure the convergences. But they will delay acknowledgement because acknowledgement carries responsibility. He predicted elongated debates, the slow drip of peer-reviewed hesitations, the unwillingness of governments to alarm populations, the private formation of committees tasked with evaluating data cohesion, and the eventual realization that cohesion was no longer avoidable. His tone never turned accusatory. It remained sorrowful. He wrote, "Denial is not wicked, it is simply unprepared." I paused, feeling a tightness in my chest. So many people I knew, rational, intelligent, capable, would respond exactly this way. Not out of ignorance, but out of dread. The scribe then described something unexpected, the emotional atmosphere of an age entering convergence. He claimed that widespread dreams, anxieties, obsessions, and symbolic fears would begin inflating across global populations. He wrote that individuals would increasingly feel as though they were waiting for something unnamed, that tension would rise without cause, that collective mood would fluctuate in strange harmony with environmental shifts. His description was painfully familiar. I turned the page. This section's final portion contained what felt like the most precise articulation the scribe had offered so far. Less poetic, more clinical. As though the scribe understood that clarity, at this stage, mattered more than metaphor. He wrote, "The approach of convergence is detectable not in catastrophe, but in coherence." He continued, "The world becomes quieter before the realization. People misinterpret this quiet as calm. It is not calm, it is alignment." I let the words sit. The quiet outside my window felt different now, not peaceful, but poised. The scribe's closing lines in this section were brief, almost restrained. Understanding does not arrive as thunder. It arrives as recognition. I sat for a long moment, absorbing the quiet, the weight of the patterns forming not just in the manuscript, but in my own thoughts. There was no dramatic revelation here, no apocalyptic prediction, no sensational climax. Only alignment, only coherence, only the deep, unsettling sense that what I had been reading was not a story moving toward an ending, but a mirror revealing what already exists. The flame beside me pulsed softly, steady as a heartbeat, and the room remained very still. The 9th cluster of pages felt older than the rest, as if they had been carried through more hands, more climates, more periods of fear and forgetting. The parchment was fragile, crackling faintly beneath my fingers, and the ink had faded into a brown so faint it resembled dried blood. I approached it slowly, sensing that whatever lay here would not expand the pattern but expose its core, the center from which all previous sections had radiated like spokes. The first line was written with an unusual firmness. "Man believes he fears destruction. He does not. He fears understanding." The scribe no longer spoke of stars, seas, or human minds. He spoke of truth itself, the unbearable clarity of seeing the world not as a sequence of accidents, but as a tapestry woven with intentless precision. He wrote that the real terror comes not from prophecy fulfilled, but from the realization that prophecy was merely observation misunderstood. He continued, "Your age will cling to randomness as a shield. For randomness excuses all patterns, and without patterns all warnings become noise." I felt a slow burn behind my eyes. I had clung to randomness myself. The comfort that if events were chaotic, then nothing was converging, nothing was being revealed. Nothing required action or acknowledgement. The scribe dismantled that comfort with quiet ruthlessness. The manuscript then shifted into a realm I had hoped it would not enter, the mechanism behind convergence. The scribe wrote, "The universe is not governed by intention. It is governed by resonance." He described resonance not as a mystical force, but as a mathematical consequence. Systems aligning when their oscillations approach compatible frequencies. Planets, atmospheres, magnetic fields, tectonic layers, biological organisms, economic behaviors, psychological moods, all vibrating in ways rarely synchronized. But during certain cosmic configurations, the oscillations draw closer, the boundaries thin, and systems begin echoing one another. Resonance, not prophecy. Convergence, not fate. He wrote, "What you call a warning is only a reflection of alignment." I felt something settle inside me, a heavy realization that the manuscript's accuracy was not the result of supernatural foresight, but of a mind that had understood systems centuries before the tools existed to measure them. The scribe next described a phenomenon he called the collective threshold, a moment when humanity's perception undergoes a quiet but irreversible shift. Not enlightenment, not panic. Something more subtle. When the mind of the age understands that its crises are connected, the age begins to awaken. He claimed that societies would experience a strange duality, a rise in despair alongside a rise in insight, an increase in fear paired with an increase in clarity. People would feel overwhelmed not by events, but by the sudden coherence between them. The scribe warned that many would attempt to numb themselves with distraction, with routine, with denial. Yet the sense of approaching integration would persist, like a distant hum vibrating through the collective subconscious. I recognized this hum. I had felt it long before opening this manuscript. The scribe then shifted into a description of the final phase of convergence, using language that felt eerily modern. He wrote of cascading signals, environmental data aligning with psychological patterns, geological activity correlating with social unrest, astronomical fluctuations echoing through human behavior. He described an age where information becomes overwhelming not because it increases, but because connections between previously unrelated data become too visible to ignore. He wrote, "You will witness the collapse of compartments. Knowledge will flow into knowledge." This idea unsettled me in ways I struggled to articulate. Our entire civilization is built on compartments, fields, disciplines, institutions, worldviews. If those compartments fail, then the narratives we use to understand reality begin to dissolve. The scribe seemed to anticipate this fear. He wrote, "Do not mistake coherence for doom. Coherence is only the revelation of truth." Yet he did not pretend there would be comfort in that revelation. The manuscript grew quieter now, the sentences shorter, sharper, as if the scribe were choosing his final words carefully. He described how individuals standing closest to patterns, researchers, analysts, thinkers, reluctant interpreters, would experience a profound internal conflict. They would see the connections before society accepted them, and this premature clarity would isolate them. He wrote, "You who read these pages will suffer the burden of early understanding." I felt a hollow expand in my chest. It was not flattery, it was diagnosis. The scribe continued, "You will attempt to forget, you will fail. You will search for doubt. Doubt will dissolve. You will seek refuge in skepticism. Skepticism will collapse under its own accumulation." His precision was suffocating. The manuscript then turned toward the fragility of human institutions during periods of approaching coherence. The scribe wrote that authorities would respond with overcorrection, increased surveillance, increased messaging, increased efforts to maintain normalcy. He claimed these reactions would not arise from malice but from fear of admitting that the world systems were no longer behaving independently. He wrote, "Power fears unity of pattern, for unity reveals vulnerability." I paused here, absorbing the subtle terror embedded in that idea. The next portion returned to the reader, not symbolically, but directly. "You believe you found this manuscript by chance. You did not. Chance is simply the name given to resonances not yet understood." My breath caught. He continued, "You read these words at a time when your world's rhythms align with mine. That is not destiny. It is timing. a strange calm began replacing the internal tension that had been twisting through me since the early pages. This was no longer a struggle for belief. It was a slow, reluctant acceptance that my own mind had already crossed a boundary, the point where resistance fades and understanding becomes the only remaining path. The scribe's final lines in this section were written with a steadiness so unlike the frantic strokes earlier in the manuscript that they felt almost ceremonial. What approaches is not an ending. It is the unveiling of a structure too large to see from within. When the mind lifts, the world sharpens. He paused for one final statement, calm, anchored, heavy. And when truth gathers, it gathers everywhere at once. I lowered the manuscript. The flame beside me barely moved, and the room felt as though it were holding its breath. The final cluster of pages felt different beneath my hands, firmer, heavier, as if the parchment itself understood that it carried the weight of completion. The edges were darkened by age, their fibers hardened like brittle bark, but the ink was unexpectedly bold, as though the scribe had written these lines with the certainty that they would outlast him. I sensed, even before reading, that these pages were not a conclusion in the traditional sense. They were an unveiling. The first sentence was neither poetic nor dramatic. It was simple, direct, and absolute. All warnings are mirrors. The scribe wrote that prophecy is not a forecast of events, but a reflection of structure. Ancient observers describing, with the language of their era, the same systems modern scientists measure with instruments. He stated plainly that the world moves in cycles because everything in existence moves in cycles. Magnetic fields, climatic bands, economic rhythms, human mood patterns, tectonic pressures, even the weak fluctuations of distant stars. He wrote, "When cycles align, the world calls it prophecy. When they diverge, the world calls it peace. In truth, both are periods of the same breath." The manuscript then turned toward the patterns I had traced in earlier sections. The subtle synchronizations, the convergences across disciplines, the quiet trembling in societies. The scribe explained each of these phenomena not as isolated crises, but as expressions of a single underlying architecture. He described the universe as a web of oscillations, frequencies interacting, amplifying, canceling, resonating. He claimed that the alignment occurring in my era, the era he had somehow foreseen, was not unique in its mechanics, but in its visibility. Humanity had developed instruments sensitive enough to detect layers of the pattern that previous generations could only sense intuitively. Your age has sight. That is its burden. I felt those words settle into the room like dust. He continued, "When men measure the heavens, the earth, their blood, their thoughts, they begin to see repetition, and repetition is revelation." The scribe described what I had feared to articulate, that the manuscript's fragments aligned with modern data not because he predicted the future, but because he understood the motions underlying all futures. His era had lacked the language of science, so he clothed the structure in metaphor. My era lacked the courage of intuition, so it clothed the same structure in denial. And now, both languages overlapped. The next section moved with the steady momentum of a mind laying out final truths. The scribe wrote, "Fear will rise as coherence rises, for coherence forces the mind to look upon its own reflection." He claimed that humanity's deepest dread is not extinction, not suffering, not disaster. It is understanding. Understanding reveals responsibility. Understanding strips away the comfort of randomness. Understanding demands awareness, and awareness demands action. He warned that the period of convergence would provoke two reactions. Some would interpret the coherence as catastrophe. Others would interpret it as awakening. He expressed no preference between the interpretations. He simply wrote, "Interpretation is nothing. Response is everything." My pulse slowed as I continued reading. There was no doom here, no apocalyptic flourish. The scribe was not preparing humanity for destruction. He was preparing humanity for realization. an unavoidably painful, profoundly clarifying moment when the world recognizes the structure beneath its own chaos. The manuscript then turned inward once more, addressing the reader directly. You have seen the pattern. You cannot return to unseeing. The words pressed into me with a quiet, steady force. He wrote that the reader, whoever reached this point, would experience a transformation not of belief, but of perception. The mind, once open to system-level coherence, cannot return to fragmentation. The scribe warned that this clarity would burden the reader with a kind of loneliness, a separation from those who still inhabit the comfort of disconnection. He who sees the whole must learn to speak gently to those who see only parts. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of that responsibility. He did not call it a blessing. He did not call it a curse. He called it a consequence. The manuscript then shifted into its final explanation, its boldest claim, and yet its simplest. The prophecy aligns with science because both describe the same structure. There was no mysticism in these lines, no supernatural flourish. The convergence was neither divine nor catastrophic. It was natural, predictable, measurable, and, once understood, undeniable. The scribe wrote, "You feared a verdict. What awaits is not judgment, it is recognition. Recognition," he explained, "is the moment when humanity finally grasps that its crises are interconnected because reality itself is interconnected, that what appears fragmented is whole, that what appears chaotic is rhythmic, that what appears accidental is structural." He ended this explanation with a phrase that landed softly but irrevocably. The world is not ending. The world is revealing. The final portion of the manuscript was written with a calmness that felt almost tender. The scribe addressed the one who would read these last lines, me, with the tone of someone offering a lantern to a traveler stepping into difficult terrain. You are not alone in this. Others will feel the same recognition. Quietly, fearfully, truthfully, seek them. He wrote that denial would persist, but only for a time. He wrote that understanding would spread slowly, like dawn gathering across the horizon. And then, in the final paragraph, the scribe wrote what felt like both a farewell and a final instruction. When you walk outside after reading these pages, do not search for signs. Look instead at what is already known. Knowledge has been speaking for longer than prophecy. You are simply awake to it now. I lowered the manuscript. The flame beside me flickered once, then steadied in a long, quiet line. I felt neither fear nor triumph, only a deep, heavy clarity, as though a veil had been lifted from the architecture of the world. The manuscript did not predict the future. It revealed the present. And I understood, with a calm I had not expected, that the warning was not a threat. It was a mirror.